Some mysteries linger not in the blaze of revelation, but in the faintest wisp of smoke left behind. Tonight, we delve into a circus of secrets, where silence masks guilt, and a missing knife whispers of betrayal. Our tale begins with shadows cast by wax and fire, and a performance rehearsed to hide a deadly truth. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us pull back the curtain on a story where every act conceals a deeper deception. It was a Tuesday, damp and unfriendly, the sort of afternoon in which the fog clung to one's coat and even Holmes's violin seemed subdued in timbre. We had just finished a modest luncheon, Holmes having consumed no more than a crust of bread and a few black grapes, when a knock sounded upon the door of our sitting room, hesitant yet urgent. Mrs. Hudson, as startled as we by the interruption, ushered in a man of peculiar aspect. He was slight and pale, with thinning auburn hair and a moustache that drooped more from nervous disuse than age. His coat was of decent make, though slightly stained at the hem, and his gloves, the gloves, were of soft leather, smudged not with soot or ink, as might be common in Fleet Street, but with something subtler, a deep blue-black that had dried along the knuckles and fingers in uneven trails. "I beg your pardon," he stammered, glancing toward the window as if he feared being followed. "I know I arrive unannounced, and at a poor hour, but I was advised there was no one else in London who might understand what I have brought." Holmes, who had not risen, offered no more than the lift of an eyebrow. "You are not mistaken, sir, but I am less concerned with the hour than with the truth. If you possess it, kindly sit and deliver it." The man sat, trembling slightly, and removed from his satchel a slim bundle bound in twine. "My name is Percival Finch," the man said, loosening the twine from the bundle. "Editor, or rather co-editor, of the Strand's Midnight Companion, a monthly digest of lurid tales for late-night readers. Nothing of great literary merit, I assure you." He placed the manuscript upon Holmes's desk with a care that seemed to exceed the value of the object itself. The papers were typed, though unevenly, and bore no cover, no signature, and no identifying heading. Holmes leaned forward but did not touch them. "I received this by post yesterday morning," Finch continued. "It arrived in a plain envelope, unmarked but for my name and the journal's address. There was no letter, no request for publication, no contact whatsoever. Perhaps a hopeful contributor with an inflated sense of drama," I suggested, though even as I spoke, I sensed the implausibility of it. Finch shook his head. "I thought the same, until I read it." His hand, now freed of its glove, tapped the top page nervously. "It is a story told in the third person, and yet—" He stopped, swallowing. "There is a tone to it, Dr. Watson. Not invention, but remembrance. Not fiction, but confession." Holmes leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "A manuscript with no name and too much truth. Go on, Mr. Finch. What precisely does this tale confess?" Finch glanced between us, his voice no more than a whisper. "Murder, Mr. Holmes. Cold, deliberate, and dreadfully real." Holmes extended a hand, and Finch passed the top page with the air of a man surrendering evidence rather than prose. Holmes's eyes scanned it silently. Meanwhile, I turned my attention to the gloves, which Finch had placed beside him on the settee. "Printers die?" I asked, nodding to the stains. Finch shook his head. "I do not work the press, Dr. Watson. Merely the words. I believe the stain came from the envelope itself. The ink had not dried." Holmes's gaze did not lift from the page. "Interesting. Ink that smudges the gloves, but not the manuscript." He turned the page over. "No watermark, no publisher's seal. No typographic house in London sets its letters in quite this manner. It is a foreign machine. German, perhaps. Slightly misaligned in the E and R. No date, no pagination. And above all," he flipped to the final sheet, No signature. Finch leaned forward anxiously. You see now, Mr. Holmes, why I believed it worth your attention. The whole thing feels cloaked, as though the author intended to be found and yet remain hidden. Holmes set the pages down, gently but with purpose. A pseudonym is one thing, he said, but this writer gives us not even a false name, which, as you rightly infer, suggests he wishes to be known, not now perhaps, but in time. Do you believe it authentic? Finch asked. Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. We shall let the story tell us that. With Holmes's approval, I took the manuscript in hand and began to read aloud. It was not long before the rhythm of the prose disturbed me, though I could not say why. The sentences were clipped, deliberate, like steps retraced on familiar ground. The narrator referred to himself only obliquely, as he, and never strayed into dialogue or direct description. And yet, the events were laid out with dreadful intimacy. He waited in the tent until the performance had begun, I read. The noise of the crowd dulled the sounds of the first preparations. No one noticed when the flame was adjusted. No one questioned that he should be near the torch. I glanced up. A circus? Holmes nodded slightly. Continue. The performer emerged, unaware. He took the torch from its place and lit it, as he had 100 times before. But this time, the breath of flame was not met with awe. It sputtered. It hissed. He fell before the act was complete. The crowd applauded, mistaking agony for theatrical collapse. There was silence when I finished. Even Holmes did not speak for a moment. It continues, Finch whispered. To describe the scent of the scorched cloth, the position of the body, even the absence of blood. Holmes rose and walked slowly to the window. There is no exaggeration, no flourish, he murmured. Just the steady, clinical recollection of one who saw it, or committed it, I added. Just so, Holmes said. Holmes turned from the window with an abruptness that startled even Finch. A murderer who writes, he said, may seek absolution, attention, or merely delay, but a murderer who writes without identity, now that is a man in conflict. Finch looked visibly unsettled. Then you do believe the tale describes an actual crime? I believe, said Holmes, resuming his seat, that the details are too precise, the silences too deliberate for fiction. This is not the work of imagination. It is the architecture of memory. He lifted the manuscript once more, his eyes moving not across the lines but over the page itself. It is what is absent that troubles me. There is no reference to place, time, names, or motive, and yet the event is so specific that it must correspond to something. It is not written for general readership. It is a map drawn in fog, waiting for someone to decipher it. A challenge? I asked. Possibly, or a plea. The man wishes to be caught, or at least questioned. He turned back to Finch. You said the envelope was plain? Entirely. No stamp, no seal. Delivered by hand, I believe. Holmes's fingers drummed once upon the armrest. Then our writer walks London's streets still, and he believes someone will read what he has written and know. Finch nodded slowly. And do you? Holmes smiled faintly. Not yet. But he has made one error, and from that we shall begin. Holmes held the last page of the manuscript to the light, scrutinizing the texture of the paper with more interest than its prose. The paper is of a thicker weave than standard stock. See here, Watson, the faint embossing along the lower margin. That is not decorative, it is functional. He reached for his magnifying lens. Yes, as I thought. It is the mark of a printer in Ipswich, a small press that supplies theatrical programmes and broadsheets to itinerant troupes. Finch looked startled. You believe the manuscript originated from a provincial printer? From one who moves often and leaves few traces, Holmes replied. A travelling circus, perhaps, or a theatre company. The The mention of a torch and the shape of the performance suggests as much. I stepped forward. But surely we would have heard of such a death if it had occurred in recent weeks. Holmes gave a thin smile. Unless it were dismissed as accident, a mishap during a flame act. Such things are more easily forgotten than one might hope. He stood. Watson, pack your bag. We are bound for the Southern Rail terminus. Ipswich is a long journey for guesswork, but this is no guess. The manuscript is not fiction, it is residue, and someone, somewhere, is sweeping away the ash before the blood is noticed. Finch rose, anxious. And if you find him? Holmes gave him a look not of triumph but of solemnity. Then I shall ask why he sent it to you. We departed Baker Street under a sky as colourless and sullen as a widow's veil, with the morning mist trailing behind our hansom cab like a shroud reluctant to part. Holmes was unusually silent, his gloved fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed upon some distant image known only to his own formidable mind. I had grown accustomed to his silences, which were rarely idle, but there was a peculiar tension to his stillness that morning, a quiet that seemed to press inward rather than release outward thought. The train to Epsom was half empty, its windows streaked with rain that had begun as a whisper and settled now into a slow, persistent rhythm upon the pane. Holmes made no remark throughout the journey, save for a low observation as we passed a burned-out farmhouse in the distance. Man is never more theatrical, he murmured, than when he convinces himself he is unseen. I asked whether he referred to our anonymous author or the alleged victim of his manuscript. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he produced the final page of the document and tapped a faint watermark near the corner. "If I am correct, Watson," he said with quiet conviction, "we are not travelling to examine an accident. We are travelling to confirm an intent." The circus had folded itself inward like a wounded creature. What remained was a collection of wagons and crates, tarpaulin sheets flapping half-heartedly in the wind, and a half-extinguished fire whose smoke carried not the cheer of campfire, but the acrid whisper of scorched oil. There were no performers in sight, no drums or distant laughter, only a pervasive stillness that felt not natural but imposed. We were received without ceremony by a Mr. Vellum, the assistant manager of the troupe, whose beard seemed to hold more authority than the man himself. He led us across the damp grass to the interior of the tent, where the fatal act had taken place just 2 nights prior. The space was cavernous and echoing, stripped now of colour and music, retaining only the ghost of spectacle. "He was called Ramon del Rio," said Mr. Vellum, gesturing toward a faint blackening of the boards. "Real name's Godfrey Jakes. Been with us 3 seasons. Knew how to handle fire better than any I've seen." "Until he didn't," Holmes murmured, stooping to inspect the stained ground. "They say he staggered, dropped the torch on himself, poor devil," Vellum continued. "But the crowd applauded. They thought it part of the show." "And no suspicion?" I asked. "None worth the word," came the reply. "He handled all his own props. If anyone tampered with them, they'd have had to be a ghost." Holmes said nothing, but I could tell from the set of his shoulders that something in the ashes had begun to speak. We stood beneath the sagging canopy as Holmes produced the manuscript once more, his gloved fingers flipping with deliberate care through the typewritten confession. He stopped halfway down the page and read quietly, lips just parting. He approached the torch as always, but this time the scent was wrong, less oil than resin. The flame was brighter, yet cold. A trick of the smoke, perhaps. He lifted it to his lips. Holmes lowered the page and gestured toward the scorched planks. "The collapse occurred precisely there?" Mr. Vellum nodded. "Took 3 men to beat the flames down. His costume caught like paper." Holmes knelt beside a battered wooden crate that bore a faded emblem of the troupe. "You told me, Mr. Vellum, that Ramon prepared his own torches. He wouldn't let anyone near them. Carried a locked chest." Holmes tapped the manuscript. Yet here, the author describes not only the act, but the sensation, the scent, the altered flame. Details unnoticed by the crowd, and which could not have been deduced from the spectacle alone. Mr. Vellum's brow furrowed. "Are you saying the fellow who wrote this was present?" Holmes said simply. "And not merely present, but intimate with the routine." A gust of wind caught the edge of the canvas and sent it flapping like a theatre curtain torn too soon. Holmes rose. The writer did not invent. He remembered. We must discover who among them saw what the crowd did not, and remained silent. Holmes began his inquiries with the stagehands, men of few words and fewer illusions, who had been closest to the act that night. One, a rough fellow by the name of Blunt, recalled the performance vividly. Ramon came out grinning, same as ever, bowed, waved the torch, took in the cheers. But then, there was something off. He hesitated just a tick. No one would have noticed unless you knew his pacing. He always paused twice before the flame. That night, he didn't. "Did he say anything?" I asked. Blunt shook his head. "Didn't have time. Flame jumped too high. Got him in the shoulder, then the chest. He dropped and, well, you saw the boards." Another witness, a contortionist named Eliza, described the moment with an odd mixture of pity and admiration. "It looked beautiful," she said, "until you realized he wasn't acting." Holmes nodded, but his attention sharpened when we spoke to the young juggler assigned to clear props. "He wasn't carrying the torch when I set the stage," the boy said. "I swear it. It was already there, resting on the hook." "Who placed it?" Holmes asked. The boy flushed. "I don't know. I thought it was him." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "No. He always brought his own flame, prepared it himself." He turned to me as we walked away. "Someone staged the scene before the performance, Watson. A sleight of hand. Not for the audience, but for the man they meant to kill." We were granted permission to inspect Ramon's belongings, now housed in a battered travel trunk near the performers' caravans. The lock had been broken by constables for inspection, though by all accounts nothing was removed. Inside, we found the trappings of his art: charred cloths, vials of thickened oil, a half-used box of matches, and several lengths of black ribbon. But it was the torch, singed, splintered, and half-extinguished, that drew Holmes's most exacting attention. He lifted it delicately and brought it beneath the afternoon light. "Note the discoloration at the base," he said, almost to himself. "And here, the inner cavity has been tampered with. The metal chamber is warped." I peered closer. "What does it suggest?" "That the torch was made to hold something it was not designed for. Perhaps a waxy substance, something unstable under flame." He used a pocket knife to scrape a residue from the inside edge, sniffed it once, and nodded grimly. "Not paraffin, something more exotic, resinous and chemically reactive." We returned to the trunk. Beneath a false lining, Holmes retrieved a broken cork and a folded scrap of paper damp with oil and time. "No label," he murmured. But the hand that filled this torch intended more than spectacle. They ensured it would burn, just once. I watched as he sealed the evidence. There was no satisfaction in his expression, only the tightening of a theory. "Whoever set the torch," he said, "did not intend a dramatic exit. They intended a death that would look like drama." The local constable, a slow-footed man named Phelps, had already filed his report: misadventure due to negligent preparation and the inherent risks of fire-based entertainment. Holmes read it without comment, then handed it back with a polite nod. "I understand your reasoning, Inspector," he said mildly, "but I fear it is in error. Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but there's no sign of struggle, no motive, just a performer and a faulty torch." Holmes turned toward the tent, where a length of canvas still bore the smoky outline of that night's event. "Ah, but that is precisely it. No struggle, no theft, no vendetta in the open. Just a man alone with his tools, and one of them placed not by him, but for him. The constable frowned. You're saying someone murdered him and counted on the crowd to applaud? Holmes gave a rare, solemn smile. Precisely. The most elegant of crimes, Inspector, executed in full view and concealed by the illusion of applause. As we turned away from the tent, the sky opened slightly and let fall a thin veil of rain, washing the soot from the boards, but not, I suspected, from Holmes's thoughts. The curtain fell too soon, Watson, he said quietly. But the play, I believe, has only begun. Though the bulk of the circus had departed under the shroud of a late-night fog, 4 men had curiously lingered in Epsom. Their caravans remained parked at the edge of the field, a motley island of wagons surrounded by trampled grass and damp canvas. They gave no indication of packing nor urgency to move. Rather, they existed in a quiet sort of defiance, like performers unwilling to strike the final pose. Holmes and I walked among them in the low morning light, our boots catching on the sodden ropes left half-coiled about the tent stakes. Holmes paused often, not at the objects, but at the absences, the uncollected crates, the tent poles left standing when others had been pulled. They were meant to follow, I offered. Perhaps the schedule has changed. Schedules rarely change for those who obey them, Holmes replied. But those who linger do so either in hope or in fear. These men remain not by accident, but by necessity. There were 4. Piotr, the strong man, with arms like meat hooks and a glower of permanent dissatisfaction. Henri, the knife-thrower, whose hands moved too elegantly for his words to be fully trusted. Mr. March, the valet to the now absent ringmaster, a man of thin wrists and neatly folded expressions, and Willie, the clown, who spoke nothing and yet seemed constantly to listen. They claim they are here to assist in dismantling, said the foreman dryly. But it's been a day and nothing's moved. Holmes's gaze narrowed. Nothing visible, perhaps, but things have moved. We found Piotr seated upon an overturned crate, methodically wrapping thick twine about his wrist. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, revealing forearms grooved with the long-set scars of performance and, one suspected, less honourable contests. He acknowledged us with a grunt, his jaw working upon something unseen. Holmes opened without pleasantry. You remained behind, Mr. Piotr. The rest of your troop have gone. There's gear to lift, he said without looking up. And no one lifts it better. Did you know Mr. Del Rio well? Piotr's eyes flicked toward Holmes, then back to his wrist. Well enough to carry him out when the flames took him. That's as well as I need. There are some, Holmes murmured, who carry men while wishing they could bury them. Piotr paused. His fingers tensed about the twine, then resumed. He was a difficult man, didn't share the pot, laughed at the wrong things. Was he feared? I asked. Feared? Piotr barked, then caught himself. Respected, maybe, but he made enemies by speaking when silence would have done. Holmes studied the man's hands, cracked at the knuckles, healed poorly in some places, as though he had fought without gloves. There are old bruises here, Holmes said softly, older than last week. Tell me, Mr. Piotr, did you and the fire-eater settle things with fists or only in your dreams? Piotr stood, towering. I carried him out, sir. That's all you need to know. Holmes nodded. Indeed. But I shall want to know what you carried in. Willie the Clown was a ghost in motley, his pale features unadorned in the day's grey light, the grease paint washed clean but never quite gone. He sat cross-legged beside an empty cage wagon, sketching shapes into the mud with a twig. When we approached, he offered a nod, but no voice. I understand he does not speak, I said quietly. Holmes crouched before him. That is the claim, but silence can be worn as costume, just as laughter can be armour. Willie responded only with the lift of one brow, a subtle performance, almost courtly in its restraint. Holmes drew a small silver token from his pocket, the embossed seal of the fire-eater's trunk, and laid it gently on the ground. Willie's eyes tracked it, then closed. "He sees more than he allows," Holmes whispered to me as we turned to leave. "And he remembers better than most. Why does he not speak?" "Because, my dear Watson," said Holmes, "he once said something that should have remained unsaid. Some men lose their voice through injury, others through conscience. He belongs to the latter category." As we walked away, I looked back. Willie still sat alone, sketching into the earth a spiral which the rain would surely erase. Henri met us beneath the arch of the main tent, where the canvas fluttered like a giant's breath. He was handsome in that angular, too precise way that seems carved rather than born, with eyes that spoke faster than his tongue, and far more often in jest. "Inspectors of tragedy," he said with a flourishing bow. "Come to ask if I aimed poorly that night." "We are not officers," Holmes replied smoothly, "only seekers of pattern, and yours is a pattern of blades." Henri chuckled. "Then you have been watching." "Yes, I throw from 20 feet, 3 paces, 1 breath. Never missed in my life." "Save perhaps in remembering," Holmes said. Henri's brow arched. "Oh? You told the boy you had 5 knives, but the act uses only 4. Henri hesitated. No more than a blink, but it was enough. "I misremembered. Old habit. I once used 5. Holmes tilted his head. "And when was that?" Henri smiled, but it did not reach the eyes. "In another life." "Lives are rarely that distinct," Holmes replied, then added lightly, "One always leaves footprints between them." As we turned to go, Henri called after us, "Ramon made enemies, Mr. Holmes. You'll find no shortage of suspects, only shortage of proof." Holmes turned, his face unreadable. "It is not proof I seek, Mr. Henri, only the crack in the performance." And with that, he walked into the breeze, leaving Henri polishing a blade that no longer shone. Mr. March was the sort of man who would have faded into wallpaper had not his posture been so deliberately upright, as though his spine had once taken instruction and never disobeyed again. We found him polishing a coach lantern outside the ringmaster's wagon, though the wagon itself bore signs of abandonment. "You served the ringmaster?" Holmes asked without introduction. "I attend to his effects," said March with polite ambiguity. "And do they require attending now that he is gone?" "Departure is not the same as desertion, sir." Holmes inclined his head. "Spoken like a man who waits for orders that shall never come." Mr. March gave the faintest of smiles. "One must prepare in case they do. Did you prepare Mr. Del Rio's torch?" "I would not presume to touch his tools." Holmes's tone sharpened. "But you had access." March did not answer, but his hands had stopped moving. "There is one among you," Holmes continued, "who wishes to disappear by appearing useful. He moves without being seen, hears without being heard." March met his gaze then. "Do you accuse me of something, sir?" "No, Mr. March," Holmes said gently. "I accuse you of remembering something you cannot speak." We left him with the cloth still resting upon the brass handle, untarnished and unwiped, like a task performed in pantomime. Holmes and I walked the perimeter of the grounds. The afternoon light now filtered through veils of mist that curled between wagons like forgotten questions. He was unusually quiet, his eyes following paths that did not exist upon the earth. "They are not accomplices, Watson," he said at last, "but men caught in proximity to guilt. Each one clutches their own secret, not of murder, but of shame. Then the murderer is among them. But he wears a mask so fine, it is not painted, it is lived." He paused beside a heap of canvas and ran his hand along a length of discarded rope. "Did you notice how they spoke of the fire-eater?" I nodded. "With caution, not sorrow." "Precisely, no grief, only survival." We reached our rooms in the nearby inn as the bells of the parish church struck 5. Holmes stood by the window, watching the distant flicker of a torch, still lit by a lingering performer. "The crime, Watson," he murmured, "was not committed with a knife or torch, but with rehearsal, and of the 4 men who remain, only 1 is still performing." He did not say which, and I did not ask. The morning air hung heavy with the scent of damp canvas and burnt cinders, as though the previous night's performance still lingered in the earth. Holmes and I made our way slowly through what remained of the circus ground, now stripped of colour and audience, its laughter reduced to a ghostly hush beneath sagging tent flaps and wheel-rutted paths. There was a peculiar quality to the silence, not one born of neglect, but of something deliberately ended, as if the stage itself had exhaled its last and now lay breathless. Holmes paused by a pile of discarded bunting and stooped to inspect a muddy handkerchief embedded in the soil. "This is where the art ends, Watson," he murmured, "and where the truth begins to show through its paint." We passed the empty animal pens and shadowed wagons, each more abandoned than the last, until we came to a low canvas awning half collapsed over a splintered trunk. Holmes drew aside the flap with a gesture almost reverent. "Here," he said softly, "the players store what the audience is never meant to see." He did not yet know what he would find, and yet something in his bearing told me he expected it to speak, not in words, but in silence. The trunk was battered and flaked with weather, its brass fittings dulled by rust and rain. Holmes lifted the lid slowly, as one might open a sarcophagus, revealing a tangle of frayed velvet, ribbon, and warped papier-mâché. Nestled amid the theatrical detritus lay a mask, full-faced, of uncanny smoothness, its mouth fixed in an unreadable expression, somewhere between serenity and restraint. A faint streak of blood marred the right cheek, and the upper edge was mottled with drips of yellowed wax, congealed unevenly like tears that had hardened mid-fall. Holmes withdrew it gently and turned it in the light. "Not a jester's piece," he said. "No bells, no flourishes, a blankness intended not to evoke, but to obscure." The eyes, holes not apertures, were wide and emotionless. In the space behind them lingered a scent I could not place, something faintly resinous, bitter-sweet, and oddly persistent. "There is nothing in the programme to account for this," I said. "No masked roles, no masquerade. Who would wear such a thing?" Holmes laid the mask across his palm and observed it with unusual solemnity. "Not a performer, Watson, not on that night." He drew a handkerchief from his coat and wrapped the object carefully. "This mask," he said, "was not meant to be seen. It was meant to see and remain unseen." We inquired discreetly among the 4 remaining members of the troupe, presenting the mask with feigned curiosity. Piotr dismissed it with a grunt, claiming no knowledge of such painted foolishness. Henri, more performative, lifted it as if admiring the curve of a blade, then handed it back with a smirk and a Gallic shrug. "I am no ghost, gentlemen," he said. "When I take the stage, I do so with my own face." Willie, ever silent, simply touched the mask's brow, and then his own cheek in a gesture I could not interpret. Mr. March, the valet, stiffened perceptibly upon seeing it, but said nothing. Holmes asked to see the performance ledger, an unremarkable book kept in the manager's caravan, detailing each act's costume and props. The entries were precise, almost obsessively so, yet nowhere within its pages was mention made of any performer requiring a full mask. Holmes closed the book and returned it to its shelf. "No one claims it," I said. "Because no one owns it," he replied. "This mask belongs to a role not written in the programme, and to a face no longer present." He tapped the ledger gently. "The missing role, Watson, is the one who rewrote the script." Holmes had taken the mask to our small quarters that evening, and under the dim lamplight, he began his careful examination. Producing a scalpel from his travelling case, he scraped delicately at the hardened wax streaking the interior edge and caught the flakes on a sheet of glass. "Stage wax," I offered, though without conviction. He shook his head. Too brittle. And note the colour, tinged with ochre. Standard grease paint does not run like this under heat. He held the sample near the flame. It curled, gave off a faint acrid scent, and left a fine soot behind. This was not intended for audience view, Holmes said quietly. The composition is crude, beeswax perhaps, with an additive, but not coloured for expression, only concealment, to alter a feature, to cover hair perhaps, or a scar. He returned to the mask, running a fingertip inside the upper rim. And here, Watson, rough stitching, recently undone. Something was once affixed, a wig, or perhaps a false crest. He sat back. This was not a tool of theatre, he said. It was a tool of transformation. I said nothing. The mask lay before us, not as artifice, but as echo of someone who had been seen only by not being seen. The next morning, Holmes returned to the tent with renewed purpose. We spoke to two stagehands, unremarkable fellows named Ellis and Dromley, who recalled Ramon's final performance in precise, if dispassionate, detail. Barefaced as always, said Ellis. He used to say fire didn't mix well with grease paint. Had a superstition about masks, added Dromley. Said it dulled the senses. Holmes nodded slowly. So on the night of his death, no covering of the face, no theatrical disguise. Never, said Ellis. He wore that long crimson coat, the one with the gold trim. Nothing more. Said the face was part of the act. Holmes stepped back, his expression sharpening as only I knew it could when thought crystallized into certainty. Then the presence of the mask, I said, is entirely anomalous. Worse, Holmes replied. It is intrusive. No actor wore it, and no audience saw it, and yet it was present, hidden among props. He turned to me. Ramon's act required not concealment, but spectacle. A mask would hinder breath, obscure vision. He would not have tolerated it near his tools. Then why was it brought? I asked. Holmes's voice was quiet. To replace a face, to permit someone to be what they were not. The mask is not the mystery, Watson. It is the method. We left the tent as the rain resumed its patient tapping upon the canvas. Steady and slow, like a hand upon the memory's door. Holmes walked in silence for a time. The mask once again wrapped and cradled in his arm. When we reached the outskirts of the encampment, I ventured a final question. You believe it was worn the night Ramon died? Holmes gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not upon the stage, but near it. The mask was not for performance, Watson. It was for presence. He turned to look back over the grounds, now strewn with damp ropes and forgotten banners. There are lies that speak, he murmured. And there are lies that remain silent, concealed beneath grease and wax. This one walked among the living with a borrowed face, and vanished before the curtain call. I shivered slightly, though the air was not cold. Then we are no longer searching for a man, I said, but for a part that was never written. Holmes' expression did not change, but there was something hollow in his tone as he replied. Precisely, Watson. The killer did not act. He hid. Beneath a mask no role ever required. And with that, we walked on, the damp grass giving way beneath our feet like breath held too long. We found Henri behind his wagon, seated cross-legged with a polishing cloth draped across his lap and 4 slender blades arranged beside him in a ritualistic fashion. He greeted us with an airy nod, his fingers never ceasing their gentle movements. Mr. Holmes, he said without looking up, I fear your inquiry may soon accuse me of misplacing my own hands. Should the opportunity arise, Holmes remained standing. Your hands, Monsieur Henri, are too well disciplined for such negligence. But a blade, now that may disappear more easily than a man might confess. Henri smiled. Ah, you refer to my missing 5th knife. Yes, it vanished some weeks ago. I blamed the strong man, though only in jest. Likely fell between floorboards or was spirited away by a curious child. Do you make habit of misplacing your tools? Hardly. These are my children, as you English say. But we live in a transient world. Props vanish, wagons shift. Holmes crouched, observing the alignment of the remaining 4. And yet you've not replaced it. A 5th knife demands its own balance. I've not had time to train a new one. Holmes nodded faintly, but I saw it, the inward tightening of thought. He would not ask more, not yet. Henri had revealed precisely what Holmes required, a vanishing that had been permitted, not lamented. Later that afternoon, Henri agreed to demonstrate his act within the still-standing rehearsal tent. With the same theatrical grace he had shown during our first encounter, he retrieved his blades and stepped into the makeshift ring, positioning 4 slender posts as targets. I usually begin with a feint to the left, he explained, then 2 quick throws centerward. The 4th follows the heartbeat, just here. He tapped his chest, and the final one completes the arc. Holmes, seated cross-legged upon an overturned crate, observed him with dispassionate eyes. I, however, could not help but be drawn to the rhythm of the man. His stance was balletic, his throw near silent, the blade thudding into the wood like punctuation. But it was in his explanation, not his execution, that Holmes found his interest. You said 5, Holmes observed quietly once Henri had concluded. Henri blinked. Did I? Quite distinctly, yet your performance involved only 4. Henri waved the comment away with a flick of his wrist. Old habit. I used 5 once, before I damaged a tendon. The 5th was purely ceremonial. Holmes stood, brushing the dust from his sleeve. Ceremonial things have a tendency to be discarded, unless, of course, they serve some new function. Henri offered a tight smile. Perhaps I misspoke. Holmes nodded. Yes, but rarely does one misspeak with such precision. It was as we departed the rehearsal tent that we came upon 2 boys, muddy-kneed and curious-eyed, lingering behind the canvas as if in search of forgotten treasures. One held a stub of chalk, the other a makeshift hoop fashioned from wire. Were you watching the gentleman's act? I asked with a smile. The younger nodded vigorously. He did it yesterday too. Threw them knives right over the clown's head. Did he throw all 5? Holmes asked casually, kneeling to their level. The boys exchanged glances. Only 4, said the elder. He always does 4. 1, 2, 3. He mimed the throws, then the one that hits the top. No 5th? Holmes asked. The younger piped up. There's a space for it. He has 5 little places in his belt, but one's always empty. Are you certain? The older nodded solemnly. We bet on it. Holmes gave them each a coin and a gentle pat upon the shoulder. You have excellent eyes, and you may have seen more than you realize. As we walked back toward the wagons, I glanced at Holmes. He spoke of a 5th. The children confirm its absence. Holmes's eyes were narrowed, but not in puzzlement, only calculation. There is nothing more revealing, he said, than the moment something is not where it should be. But surely a missing knife proves nothing. No, Watson, he murmured, but it implies everything. We returned to our lodging as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, thoughtful shadows across the floorboards. Holmes stood by the window, fingers interlaced behind his back, watching the tents shift in the breeze like fading ghosts. Tell me, Watson, he said without turning, why would a man describe a 5-blade act, perform 4, and keep one sheath empty night after night? Sentiment, superstition, perhaps. But in Henri's case, neither quite fits. He is a man of artifice, not reverence. I considered this. Then he wishes it noticed. Precisely. The missing 5th is part of the performance, not for the audience, but for those who observe patterns. I stepped forward. You believe the 5th knife was removed not by accident, but intent. He nodded. It is the most subtle of weapons, a blade unseen. If a performer alters his routine by omission, it becomes an act of concealment rather than invention. So it was never meant to be thrown. No, Watson, Holmes said softly. It was meant to be used. He turned from the window at last. And what better place to hide such intent than in the space where everyone assumes it has always belonged? We returned that evening under pretense of collecting Henri's account for a profile I was supposedly drafting. He received us amiably, even proudly offering his knives for our inspection. Long, elegant instruments of steel with engraved handles worn smooth by repetition. Holmes accepted them with delicate fingers and laid them out across a table, aligning their tips with military precision. Then slowly he turned each one over, examining the base, the groove of the hilt, the minute wear at the edge. "Curious," he murmured. "This blade, number 3, I believe, shows uneven sharpening. The bevel is more acute, less consistent." "I re-edge that one more often," Henri replied. "It strikes metal sometimes. Old habit." Holmes did not correct him, though I noted the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. He weighed the blade in his palm, comparing it to the others, then set it aside. "This one would not fly straight," he said simply. "It does for me," Henri replied, too quickly. Holmes examined the belt sheath. "And yet the 5th slot remains empty." Henri said nothing. Holmes handed back the blades with courteous formality. "Thank you, Monsieur Henri. One learns much from the things a man's claims still belong to him." And as we turned to leave, Holmes whispered, and even more from the ones he quietly lets go. Night had fully descended by the time we returned to our quarters. The moon hung low and indifferent, casting a cold light over the rooftops and the abandoned ring. Holmes poured himself a cup of tea, untouched, and sat at the small table, his fingers lightly tapping against the porcelain. "It is curious, Watson," he said at last, "how silence grows louder the longer one listens to it." I waited. The blade was not lost. It was hidden, not discarded in panic, but prepared. Its absence from the belt is not carelessness. It is design. "You believe he removed it in order to—" "Yes." Holmes's voice was quiet. "To replace it elsewhere, perhaps in a torch, perhaps in a disguise, but most assuredly into a man's path." I shuddered. "Then it was not just the torch that killed Ramon." "No," he said. "It was the illusion of normalcy, the confidence of routine. He stepped into a moment he had lived 100 times, never knowing that one element had been subtracted and replaced with death." Holmes leaned back, his gaze far away. "The murderer's genius, Watson, lies not in what he showed us, but in what he chose to withhold." It was late into the evening when Holmes and I returned to the circus encampment, drawn by a message from the remaining troop that one of their number, Willie the Clown, lay gravely ill. When we arrived at the small caravan where he was housed, the first thing to strike me was the silence, absolute, heavy and unnatural in a place once so filled with raucous laughter and the patter of feet. Willie lay prostrate on a narrow cot, his face a ghastly contrast to the jovial mask he bore by day. The chalk-white makeup was still faintly discernible upon his cheeks and lips, but now marred by the clammy sheen of fevered sweat. His eyes, wide and unblinking, held a glassy vacancy that betrayed no hint of his usual mirth. Beside him, his small trunk remained unopened, its contents untouched, as though the owner himself had been suspended mid-performance, incapable of resuming even the simplest ritual. Holmes observed quietly, noting the tautness of Willie's jaw and the subtle tremor in his hands. "A silence heavier than mere muteness, Watson," he remarked softly. "One burdened by memory rather than infirmity." I took Willie's hand in mine, feeling the unnatural chill beneath the painted surface. "Is there no physician here?" "There is, sir," said one of the troop, "but none can reach the words to speak with him." Holmes knelt by the cot, his keen gaze never leaving the pale figure. "Sometimes," he whispered, "it is not the voice that fails, but the will to use it." The night was still when I sat by Willie's bedside, attending to his fevers with a cloth dampened in cool water. The room was dim, lit only by a flickering candle whose flame cast long, restless shadows upon the caravan's worn walls. It was then, in the depths of his restless sleep, that I caught the faintest utterance, so slight that I paused, uncertain if it were but the murmur of wind. Judith! The name floated from his lips, tremulous and laden with anguish, as if torn from the recesses of a torment too profound for waking thought. I leaned closer, wishing to catch more, but Willie relapsed into silence, breathing uneven and shallow. The name struck a chord deep within me, stirring questions and images. Who was Judith, and what spectre did she cast upon this silent man? Summoning Holmes, I relayed the whisper. His expression was unreadable, but I noted the sharp intake of breath. That name, he said slowly, is the key to a door long closed. We must find where it leads. And so, in the faint candlelight and the heavy hush of that caravan, we began to unravel a thread stretching far beyond the present grief. Our search led us to a dimly lit archive in the town hall, where Holmes, with his usual efficiency, sifted through newspapers, coroner's reports, and yellowing ledgers chronicling past misfortunes. Among them, a particular fire caught his eye. An inferno at a travelling circus 5 years prior. A tragedy whispered of but largely forgotten by the public. A woman named Judith had perished under suspicious circumstances. Her death was recorded as accidental poisoning, the details curiously sparse and contradictory. Holmes fingered a brittle newspaper clipping. Note the description, Watson. Flames engulfed the canvas, yet the victim bore no burns. Only the symptoms of ingestion. A rare toxin, perhaps. Or a slow, unseen betrayal. He looked up, eyes gleaming with that familiar intensity. The parallels are striking. Ramon's death is but an echo of this earlier flame, and Willie's muteness, a silence born of that past horror. I could only nod, aware that we had stumbled upon a history more tangled than any mere accident. Holmes closed the folder decisively. It appears, Watson, that the present mystery is not confined to a single night, but woven through a fabric of fire and secrets stretching back years. The name Judith was no mere whisper. It was the key to understanding the shadows that haunted us still. In the course of our investigations, Holmes led me to peruse the old records once more, this time seeking traces of another tragedy whose shadows lingered in the flicker of Ramon's recent death. It was an event that had long faded from public memory, yet bore the unmistakable mark of cruel coincidence. A fire that had consumed a portion of a travelling circus nearly 5 years prior. The victim had been a woman named Judith, whose passing was recorded with curious brevity and contradiction. Though engulfed by flame, the coroner's report noted a lack of visible burns, attributing her demise instead to the effects of poison, a slow choking agent that had left her breathless without scar. More perplexing was the account of a witness, a performer, who vanished soon after the incident, his silence as complete as the ashes that consumed the tent. This man's fate was never clarified, and the trail ended in hushed speculation. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar light as he traced parallels. Observe, Watson, how the past mimics the present, two conflagrations separated by years, bound by smoke and silence. Ramon's fall is not an isolated accident, but a dark echo. I could not help but feel the weight of the unseen, the vanishing acts of those who both witness and conceal. We returned once more to Willie's side, whose fevered rest continued unabated. Yet in the quiet intervals, Holmes considered the nature of the man's muteness with a gravity that bespoke more than mere observation. It is not, I suspect, an injury of the tongue that keeps him silent, Holmes said thoughtfully. No wound of flesh could so thoroughly silence a soul as one of conscience. I ventured a question. You believe Willie chose this silence? Holmes nodded slowly. Fear and guilt are sometimes sharper than any blade, Watson. Willie may have witnessed the fateful moment in the past, some act of cruelty or betrayal, and, unable to intervene or stop it, he sealed his voice as a penance. The other members of the troupe spoke of Willie's sudden withdrawal years earlier, his refusal to speak even in moments of joy or crisis. Yet Holmes discerned in that silence a discipline rather than defeat, a barricade against memory too painful to bear. To live among performers and not perform is a torment akin to the executioner's own sentence, he remarked. I looked at Willie's pale face, painted still faintly in the ghost of a smile, and wondered what secrets were locked behind those silent lips. In the waning hours of that sombre evening, Holmes bent beside Willie once again, his hand resting lightly upon the trembling shoulder of the man who had long ceased to speak. The candle's flame flickered, casting fragile shadows that danced across the worn wooden walls. Judith, Holmes murmured softly, the single name a key turned in an invisible lock. Willie's eyes fluttered open, fixed upon Holmes's face with a depth that belied his outward stillness. A tremor passed through him, and a single tear escaped the corner of his eye, an unvoiced confession. No words came, but in that silent communion, Holmes found his confirmation. The name, weighted with sorrow and memory, was not simply a ghost of the past, but a living tether to a wound yet unhealed. I watched the detective's face, seeing the rare flicker of compassion hidden beneath his usual detachment. Sometimes, Holmes said quietly, what is not said is the loudest truth of all. We left Willie to his dreams and retired into the night, burdened now with the knowledge that the past still clung with deadly intent to the present, and that some mysteries could only be glimpsed in the spaces between speech. During our lingering inquiries at the circus encampment, I observed Holmes's attention repeatedly drawn toward a solitary wagon resting apart from the others. Its paint faded and its wheels sunk slightly into the muddy earth. This was the ringmaster's personal coach, though the ringmaster himself had long since departed. The wagon bore a heavy lock, its iron clasp polished by a careful hand, and each evening, as dusk surrendered to darkness, Mr. March, the valet, approached it alone. Holmes had noticed this pattern on more than one occasion, and voiced his curiosity with characteristic subtlety. You mark that, Watson. March's nightly vigil before this locked carriage is no mere habit. It is a ritual of significance. One evening, as the sky bruised with twilight, we followed the valet at a respectful distance. March produced a key, small and ornate, which he held as though it were a talisman. The lock gave way with a faint click, and the heavy door swung open to admit us into a cramped interior, heavy with the scent of dust, wax, and something faintly floral yet sour. March's eyes darted between Holmes and me, betraying a reticence that seemed at odds with his otherwise precise demeanour. Holmes stepped inside first, his gaze sweeping the small chamber as if seeking a clue concealed beneath the layers of time. Few come here, Holmes said softly, but what they leave behind speaks volumes. The coach's interior was a crypt of memories, dim and sombre beneath the flickering light of a single oil lamp. Seated upon a faded velvet chair was a wax figure, dressed in the tattered remnants of a bridal gown that might once have dazzled beneath the glow of gaslight and applause. The gown, white but now yellowed, was cracked and mottled, its lacework worn thin by dust and time. The figure's face was pale and expressionless, a frozen mask of quiet suffering. Cracks marred the surface, and where once rose a delicate coiffure, strands of wax had melted away, revealing the fragile armature beneath. Before the figure stood a mirror draped in cobwebs, its glass dulled until it reflected little more than shadow. Holmes approached reverently. A bride preserved yet abandoned, not a celebration, but a lament. I noted the stillness, the way the air seemed to weigh heavier here, as if the walls themselves mourned a lost promise. This was no mere prop for spectacle. It was a shrine to absence. March remained at the threshold, his eyes downcast, unwilling or unable to speak of what we had found. The silence hung between us like a pall, and for a moment none dared break it. In gentle coaxing, Holmes addressed March about the figure, careful not to press too sharply. "This waxwork, Mr. March, belongs to one of great importance, I believe." March hesitated, fingers clasped tightly before him. "She was the ringmaster's fiancée," he said at last, voice low and measured. "A woman of rare grace named Judith." He swallowed hard, and the name seemed almost too heavy to utter. The ringmaster loved her deeply. Their marriage was to have been celebrated here, under the big top itself. "But the wedding never came," Holmes said softly. "No. A fire consumed their previous encampment. Judith was trapped in the blaze, her death sudden and without comfort." March's gaze lifted, distant and mournful. "The ringmaster never recovered. This wax figure was made in her likeness, a memorial of love and loss." Holmes studied him for a long moment. "And you keep this vigil alone?" March nodded. "It is my penance, sir, a daily remembrance of a failure to protect." I could see the weight of that penance pressed upon the valet's slender shoulders, a sorrow as tangible as the wax that bore her image. Holmes leaned close to the figure, inspecting the subtle disfigurements that time and flame had etched into the wax. The sunken cheek betrayed an exposure to intense heat. The neckline bore scars of melting that hinted at proximity to fire. Yet these damages had been arrested and preserved with painstaking care, a testament to a memory kept alive in wax. "It is curious," Holmes remarked. "Wax is a fragile medium, liable to change with temperature and touch, yet this figure has been held fast in a moment of decay, preserved as if to arrest grief itself." He circled the figure slowly. "The damage confirms the story. This woman was consumed by fire, but never forgotten. The waxwork is less a tribute and more a confession." He looked at March, who stood silent and pale. "To maintain such a memorial daily is to live beneath its shadow, Mr. March. Does it comfort or condemn?" March did not answer, but his clenched hands spoke volumes. Holmes continued, "Memory is sometimes the fiercest fire, one that does not consume but haunts. I found myself drawn to the waxen bride, a spectral figure imprisoned between love and tragedy, whose silent testimony seemed to echo through the empty coach. As we prepared to depart, Holmes reflected aloud on the strange rites that bind grief and guilt inextricably. "This waxwork is no mere relic, Watson. It is a shrine, an outward symbol of inward torment. It is a frozen confession dressed daily in ceremony and solitude." He gestured towards March. "The valet tends to this figure not to honour, but to atone. Each careful touch a penance for sins perhaps unspoken." I considered the profound burden this silent man bore, forever caught between duty and remorse, serving a love now lost to flame and shadow. Holmes's voice softened. "Such guilt is a prison more confining than any cage or tent." We left behind the coach, its air thick with unspoken sorrow, and walked once more into the gathering dusk. At the threshold of the encampment, I glanced back toward the waxen bride and the mirror draped in cobwebs. The glass was dull and mottled, no reflections stirred upon its surface save the absence of life. Holmes's words fell softly beside me. "Memory is the truest ghost, Watson. It haunts not in form, but in the empty spaces it leaves behind." I found myself pondering this as the mist thickened, obscuring the outline of the coach and the lingering figure within. The bride's visage was fixed forever in silent lament, and yet the reflection it sought never appeared. The past had claimed its due, yet the present remained burdened with its shadow. And so, beneath the cold sweep of night, we turned away, leaving ghosts to their vigil and mysteries to their slow, relentless unfolding. Holmes had arranged a meeting beneath the great canvas of the main tent, where the echoes of applause still seemed to linger in the cool evening air. The four men who had lingered so long in Epsom, Piotr the strong man, Henri the knife thrower, Willie the silent clown, and Mr. March, the ringmaster's valet, were summoned with little explanation, but with the implicit gravity that comes only from the presence of the great detective himself. They arrived in varying moods. Piotr with a wary scowl, Henri with an unsettling charm, Willie as quiet and watchful as ever, and March with that stiff, reserved manner of one who carries burdens not his own. Holmes greeted them without preamble, his eyes alight with that unmistakable gleam of purpose. "Gentlemen," he began, "the time has come to revisit a final performance, one not played for applause, but for truth." I observed the subtle shifts in their faces, a twitch here, a tightening of the jaw there, as Holmes spoke of final statements, though none spoke a word. The tent seemed to contract around us, as if the memory of that night had drawn its curtains close and awaited its reckoning. Holmes took his place at the centre of the ring and began with a measured account of the events on the night Ramon met his fiery end. His voice was low, but carried to every corner, each word deliberate, each phrase a thread weaving the fabric of a carefully choreographed act. "One," he said, indicating Piotr. "You bore the weight of the apparatus, preparing the stage and ensuring the flames could be controlled. Your strength was relied upon, but your restraint was equally tested." He turned to Henri. "Two, you, the knife thrower, commanded precision and danger. Your blades were tools of performance, but on that night one was absent from your hand." Willie remained still, but Holmes's gaze softened as he addressed the mute clown. "Three, Willie, your silence was not absence, but presence. Your role was to distract, to charm, to mask what others sought to conceal. Lastly, March, who stood stiffly beside the tent pole, and you, valet, keeper of the ringmaster's secrets and confidences. Your presence was quiet, but indispensable." Holmes paused, eyes gleaming with a quiet fire. "Together, you performed a scene so polished it could deceive all but the keenest eye. Yet within this sequence, a line vanished, a detail omitted, rehearsed away." The men shifted uneasily as Holmes's words carved the space between them with cold precision. Holmes produced the 5 knives once more, laying them upon a small wooden crate, as if presenting evidence in a court of law. 4 lay in their accustomed places, but the 5th was absent. "This missing blade," he said slowly, "was known to us as lost or misplaced. But its absence was not an accident. It was rather a deliberate omission from the act." His eyes turned to Henri. "Yet we find this very knife hidden within the torch that Ramon wielded in his final moments. A device of performance transformed into an instrument of death." The silence was heavy, broken only by Henri's composed breath. Holmes continued. "A blade not thrown, but used, concealed within fire, its edge unseen until too late." He looked around the circle of men, whose faces now betrayed the flicker of fear and calculation. "The brilliance of this scheme lies in its subtlety, a weapon invisible to the audience, a murder masked by spectacle." Henri's fingers twitched, yet his expression remained unreadable. Holmes's gaze was unyielding. The 5th blade did not vanish. It awaited its moment, and with those words, the final act of deception was laid bare. As the evening wore on beneath the fading tent, Holmes's eyes remained fixed on Willie, the mute clown, whose silence had long been dismissed by all save the most attentive. But Holmes now regarded that silence with renewed interest, as though it were a language in itself. "It was never mere muteness, Watson," he said quietly. "Willie's silence concealed a signal, an unseen cue." I watched as Holmes spoke, noting the detective's rare moment of reflection on human frailty beneath his usual detachment. "Consider the timing," Holmes continued. "The moment the deception truly began was not the murder itself, but the instant Willie ceased his distractions, the heartbeat when his performance fell away and the others moved forward. That pause was permission. The others had taken the stage, unaware that the mute clown's withheld laughter was the green light for what followed. It was not absence, Holmes said, but deliberate presence, silence that allowed the crime to unfold unnoticed. I found myself shivering at the notion of such calculated quietude, how a single breath held too long could become the instrument of death. Holmes's attention then shifted to Mr. March, the valet whose meek exterior belied a complexity we were only beginning to fathom. Holmes spoke slowly, each word weighted with certainty. It was not Ramon who prepared the fire for his final act, Holmes declared. This was done by a hand hidden in plain sight, the gloved hand of Mr. March. The valet's pale face did not betray emotion, but his hands twitched slightly. March had access to both the torch and the wax blade concealed within it, Holmes explained. A man in service to another's secrets, yet capable of wielding his own. Holmes unfolded the evidence, the altered torch, the concealed weapon, and laid bare the intimate knowledge required to perform such a sinister preparation. Who better than one devoted to the ringmaster's trust to engineer a death that masqueraded as accident? March remained silent, but the quiet was no longer mere submission. It was the silence of a man weighed by his own design. Holmes turned then to Henry, the knife-thrower, whose polished charm now seemed edged with a sharper intent. All four men played their parts in a carefully staged charade, Holmes said, but only one knew the truth beneath the rehearsal. His gaze locked onto Henri's. You, Monsieur Henri, understood from the start that the fifth knife would not return for the final throw. Henri's composure faltered for the briefest moment, a flicker that Holmes seized upon with the precision of a hawk. To rehearse a performance so well as to mask murder is a rare and dangerous art. Henri said nothing, but I saw the tightening of his jaw and the flicker of a shadow pass behind his eyes. Holmes stepped back, his expression cold and resolute. What was intended as a rehearsal, he said, became, in Henri's hands, a perfect performance of death, a murder without misstep, enacted before an audience that applauded ignorance. The four men stood in silence, the weight of Holmes's accusation pressing upon them. Applause, Holmes concluded softly, without witnesses, a killing, consummated without error. He turned away, the flicker of the tense lanterns casting long shadows behind him. And thus, the curtain fell not on an accident, but on a deliberate act, hidden by the artifice of the stage. I felt the chill of truth settle upon us. A rehearsal never meant to end, but to conclude with finality. The four men gathered within the dim interior of the main tent, their faces drawn and tense beneath the waning lantern light. Holmes stood at the centre, his gaze steady and unyielding, while I watched the subtle shifts of unease ripple among them. The silence, heavy as the night, was broken only by the faint rustle of canvas and the distant call of a nightbird. Holmes began with deliberate calm. Gentlemen, the truth has long been rehearsed in your presence, yet concealed beneath layers of deception. It is now time for the final act to be revealed. He fixed his gaze on Henri, the knife-thrower, whose usual charm had curdled into a brittle mask. You, Monsieur Henri, are the architect of Ramon's demise. The fifth knife, absent from your act, yet present in the torch, was your instrument, not of performance, but of murder. The room held its breath. Piotr's hand clenched into a fist. Willie averted his eyes. Mr. March remained immobile. Holmes's voice dropped to a near whisper. No applause followed that night, for the audience was deceived by artifice, and the victim silenced before the final bow. Holmes produced the wax-smeared mask, its cracked surface and bloodstains illuminated by the lantern's flicker. This mask, he said, turning it slowly in his hands, was worn not for spectacle, but as a shield against recognition, a disguise to deceive the eyes of guilt. He looked directly at Henri. You wore it to hide your intent, to conceal the man behind the blade, and to cloak the dark resolve beneath your practiced grace. The knife-thrower's lips pressed tight, his usual eloquence silenced by the weight of accusation. Holmes continued. It is no coincidence that this mask was found in the prop chest among broken dreams, a symbol of the false face you presented to the world. I noted how the mask's melted wax and dried blood mirrored the fire that had consumed Ramon, a haunting metaphor of destruction and concealment intertwined. The mask, Holmes concluded, was the final deception in a performance meant only for one spectator, death itself. Holmes's voice softened as he began the tale of Judith, a name that hung in the air like smoke. 5 years ago, this circus was marred by tragedy. Judith, the ringmaster's fiancée, perished in a fire that was never fully explained. She died not of flame, but of poison. A silent and cruel end. He paced slowly, eyes distant. Ramon, the fire-eater, bore a cruelty that few dared confront. It is said his indifference contributed to Judith's fate, a bitterness that festered in the shadows. Holmes turned to Henri. Your descent began then, fueled by grief and the sting of injustice. Revenge took form not in fury, but in cold, precise artifice. I saw the lines deepen on Henri's face, a man haunted by memory and driven by a past that refused to yield. Judith's name, Holmes said quietly, is the thread that binds these deaths. A ghost burned into silence, calling for retribution through the flames. Holmes held one of Henri's knives aloft, its edge gleaming faintly in the lantern light. This blade was not merely sharpened, Holmes explained, but treated with a rare alkaloid derived from a venomous circus snake, a poison slow to act but swift in silence. He detailed the subtle modifications, the wear on the metal that spoke of frequent handling and a careful hand. Such preparation is no accident. It is the work of a man who remembers, who bears the weight of loss and sharpens it into a weapon. Henri's gaze fell. I knew what I wielded, each cut a remembrance. Holmes's voice took on a somber tone. The blade was more than steel. It was memory made manifest, a slow, cruel justice. I shuddered at the thought of such calculated vengeance concealed beneath the guise of performance. With the truth laid bare, Henri's facade crumbled. He did not rage nor plead. Instead, he confessed with a tragic clarity that chilled the room. Murder was the only performance I ever mastered, he said quietly. Each throw, each glance was rehearsed in silence until the final act could no longer be undone. He spoke of Judith, of loss, and of a justice twisted into artifice, a performance where the applause was replaced by silence, and the curtain fell on vengeance rather than celebration. Holmes listened intently, his gaze never faltering. When Henri finished, the tent seemed heavier, burdened by the weight of a life shaped by grief and calculated cruelty. It is a sorrowful thing, Holmes remarked, when the theatre of revenge consumes the player entirely. Henri nodded, eyes downcast. I sought only to right a wrong, but in doing so, I became the villain. As the constable led Henri away, Holmes and I stood quietly amidst the empty tents, the night air cool and still around us. Holmes spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of reflection rather than triumph. Revenge, Watson, is not born of violence alone, but of love that has curdled into artifice, a performance played without audience, where the only witness is conscience. I nodded, feeling the somber truth in his words. Henri's act was justice writ in shadows, Holmes continued, without applause, without recognition, and yet absolute in its execution. The tent flaps swayed gently as if murmuring farewell, and I realized that some dramas end not with fanfare, but in quiet reckonings. Holmes turned to me with a faint smile. Let us hope, Watson, that the final act of this tragedy brings peace to the living, if not to the ghosts that linger. The morning was heavy with rain, a a slow and steady descent that dulled the colours of the circus tents and washed the brightness from the once vibrant encampment. I stood at a respectful distance, watching as men laboured with weary precision, pulling at ropes, loosening tent pegs, and folding canvas into heavy, sodden bundles. Each peg withdrawn seemed a silent concession to finality, a surrender not just of the physical shelter, but of the illusions it had once upheld. The earth beneath was softened by relentless wetness, and the air hung thick with the scent of damp fabric and trampled grass. The vibrant laughter and clatter of drums had long since faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of labour and the occasional murmur of resigned voices. I noticed Holmes's gaze, steady and sombre, fixed upon the collapsing structures, as if the very act of dismantling mirrored the unravelling of the mystery we had pursued. The tents, once proud sentinels of spectacle and wonder, now sagged under the weight of rain and memory alike. Ghosts of a theatre that had closed without curtain or applause. Holmes and I departed the scene in near silence, the carriage wheels turning softly against the sodden road, carrying us away from the scattered remnants of a faded carnival. The countryside rolled past in muted greys and greens, shrouded beneath a sky heavy with the promise of more rain. Behind us, a thin wisp of smoke curled lazily against the horizon, perhaps the final exhalation of a fire smouldering among abandoned props and forgotten dreams. Its faint tendrils vanished slowly into the overcast sky, much like the fleeting truths we had uncovered amid the circus's shadows. Holmes's profile was calm, yet distant, his sharp eyes staring through the gloom as if weighing not the countryside, but some far more elusive matter. I dared not break the silence, sensing that the silence held its own significance, a quiet moment of reflection on a case that had challenged even his formidable intellect. In that quiet journey home, the world seemed to hold its breath, a liminal space between revelation and resolution. After a time, Holmes broke the stillness with words slow and measured, carrying the weight of final contemplation. "Watson," he said softly, "there are those among us who do not merely wear masks for a moment's performance, but who become their masks entirely. Such men vanish when the disguise is stripped away." I listened, intrigued by this unusual intimacy in his tone, as he continued. The fire-eater's death was not merely a tragedy of flame, but of identity. Ramon del Rio was a man who thrived behind the spectacle, but when the mask faltered, the man beneath was exposed and destroyed. Holmes's gaze drifted toward the rain-splattered window. The valet who tended a waxen bride, the clown who chose silence, the knife-thrower who rehearsed revenge, all wore masks, some literal, some of the circumstance. They acted parts not wholly their own, caught in a theatre of life that demands performance even when the soul rebels. He sighed softly. "It is the paradox of our existence, Watson. Some men become their disguises, and in losing them, disappear entirely." The melancholy in his voice struck me deeply, a reminder that beneath every mystery lies a human heart bound by fear and longing. As the hansom neared the familiar streets of London, I closed my notebook, the final words of our investigation settling in my mind like the evening mist. Holmes sat quietly beside me, his expression for once turned inward rather than outward, his gaze distant and contemplative. The rain fell steadily, softening the harsh outlines of the city, the sharp edges of chimneys, rooftops, and gas lamps blending into the gentle blur of twilight. It was as if the world itself sought to wash away the final tensions of the case, leaving only the quiet residue of reflection. I glanced at Holmes, noting the rare vulnerability in his countenance, as though the burdens of truth weighed more heavily than usual. "Some cases," he murmured, "do not end with triumph or relief, but with a lingering sadness, a reminder that human nature is both the greatest mystery and the most enduring mask." I nodded silently, knowing that in the rain's steady fall, we had found not just answers, but the poignant cost of those answers. Holmes settled into his chair, fingers steepled thoughtfully as he regarded the flickering fire. "Watson, this case reveals that the greatest masks are not those worn upon the stage, but those men fashion in their hearts. Revenge, when rehearsed and concealed beneath the guise of performance, becomes a tragedy not only for the victim, but for the avenger himself." He paused, eyes sharp. "Tell me, what do you believe was Henri's gravest error in this deadly theatre? Was it the act itself, or the arrogance to think he could control the final scene? I turn to you now. What do you think was the criminal's biggest mistake? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this mystery, please like, subscribe and share with fellow lovers of deduction and intrigue. More tales await those who seek the truth hidden in shadow.